At first, I thought the letter in my mailbox was just a friendly neighborhood update, but the bold red letters at the top said otherwise. Notice of fine, $500. My crime, apparently excessive illumination visible from the street, which is the point of Christmas lights, isn't it? But here's the strange thing. I hadn't even finished putting them up yet. Someone had been watching me, and the deeper I dug into who filed the complaint, the more I realized this wasn't just HOA policy. This was personal. Welcome back to HOA Hustle, where we dive deep into the suburban battlegrounds that make Game of Thrones look like a peaceful family dinner. I'm your host, and today we're talking about something that hits different during the holidays. That special breed of HOA insanity that makes you want to move to a cabin in the woods. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thinks they're running a military compound instead of a neighborhood, you know exactly what I'm talking about. These are the people who measure your grass with rulers and lose sleep over the wrong shade of beige on your mailbox. But what happens when someone finally decides they've had enough? What happens when a homeowner with too much time, too much money, and just enough spite decides to fight fire with a literal fireworks display? Well, grab some popcorn, because Margaret Chen's revenge story is about to become your new obsession. Let me introduce you to Margaret Chen. At 67 years old, Margaret was living what most people would call the perfect retirement. She'd spent 30 years as a mechanical engineer for Boeing, designing systems that literally had to work in space. She was methodical, precise, and had a brain that could solve problems most people couldn't even understand. Margaret had moved to Willowbrook Estates in 2019, thinking she'd found her forever home. And honestly, it seemed perfect on paper then. This wasn't some cookie-cutter subdivision. We're talking about a planned community in suburban Seattle with tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The HOA marketed itself as preserving property values and community standards. Their website showed happy families walking dogs, kids riding bikes, and neighbors chatting over pristine white picket fences. They promised reasonable guidelines that enhance everyone's quality of life. Yeah, right. Margaret's first red flag should have been the 47-page HOA covenant she had to sign. 47 pages. For comparison, the Declaration of Independence is 4 pages. But hey, she was buying her dream home, and she figured she could handle some basic rules about keeping her lawn tidy. The Willowbrook HOA was run by a 5-person board, led by a man named Richard Pemberton. Now, Richard was exactly what you'd expect from an HOA president who takes the job way too seriously. Mid-50s, worked in middle management at an insurance company, and treated HOA violations like they were federal crimes. Richard lived 3 houses down from Margaret, and he had what you might generously call strong opinions about neighborhood aesthetics. He was the kind of guy who would walk around the subdivision with a clipboard, measuring the height of hedges and photographing slightly faded mailboxes. For the first few years, Margaret flew under the radar. She kept her yard immaculate, painted her house the approved shade of coastal sage, and never put her trash cans out before 6 p.m. on collection day. She was a model homeowner. But Margaret had one weakness: Christmas decorations. See, Margaret's late husband David had been obsessed with Christmas lights. Every year he'd spent weeks turning their old house into a winter wonderland. It wasn't over the top, just tasteful strings of warm white lights and some garland around the windows, maybe a wreath on the door. After David passed in 2021, continuing that tradition became Margaret's way of keeping his memory alive. So in December 2022, Margaret put up what she thought was a modest display: string lights along the roofline, some illuminated deer in the yard, and a beautiful 9-foot Christmas tree visible through her front window. She used warm LED bulbs, everything was professionally installed, and she made sure to turn everything off by 10 p.m. out of respect for her neighbors. It was tasteful, it was beautiful, and according to the HOA, it was a violation. On December 15th, Margaret found a certified letter in her mailbox. The subject line read, "Notice of covenant violation, excessive holiday decorations." The letter, signed by Richard Pemberton himself, informed Margaret that her Christmas display violated Section 4.7 of the HOA covenant, which stated that seasonal decorations should be modest and in keeping with the community's aesthetic standards. Modest. They were calling her 3 strings of lights immodest. But here's where it gets ridiculous. The violation notice didn't just ask her to tone it down. It demanded she remove all decorations immediately and included a $150 fine for willful disregard of community standards. Margaret was stunned. She walked around the neighborhood that evening, looking at other houses. Mrs. Patterson had inflatable snowmen that were definitely larger than Margaret's deer. The Johnsons had icicle lights covering their entire 2-story house. Half the neighborhood had more decorations than she did. So why was she being singled out? Margaret decided to fight it. She submitted a formal appeal, complete with photographs of other houses and measurements proving her display was actually smaller than average. She cited specific sections of the covenant and even included a spreadsheet comparing her decoration density to other homes. The HOA board's response? Denied. No explanation, no discussion, just a form letter that said her appeal had been reviewed and found to be without merit. Oh, and they increased her fine to $300 for frivolous appeals. That's when Margaret realized what was really going on. This wasn't about Christmas lights. This was about power. Richard Pemberton and his board had decided she was an easy target, a widow who wouldn't fight back. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Margaret paid the fine, but she didn't take down her decorations. Not yet. Instead, she did what any good engineer would do. She started researching. She requested a complete copy of the HOA covenant, all board meeting minutes from the past 5 years, and detailed records of every violation notice issued in the subdivision. And because this was an HOA, they legally had to provide them. What Margaret found was absolutely infuriating. First, the excessive holiday decorations rule had never been enforced before. In 5 years of board meeting minutes, there wasn't a single mention of Christmas light violations until hers. The Johnsons, who had a display twice the size of Margaret's, lived right across from Richard's house, never fined. Second, Richard had been issuing violations almost exclusively to single women and elderly homeowners. The 78-year-old widow who got fined for her garden gnomes. The single mom who got cited for parking her car on the street overnight. The elderly couple who got a violation for their non-conforming bird feeder. But the young families with loud parties, overgrown lawns, and actual code violations? Somehow they never made it onto Richard's clipboard. Margaret realized she wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. She was dealing with a bully who used his position to harass people he thought couldn't fight back. So she decided to play by their rules. All of their rules. Margaret spent January through August of 2023 becoming an expert in HOA law. She read every statute, every court case, every precedent about homeowner association governance. She learned about covenant enforcement, due process requirements, and the legal obligations of HOA boards. But more importantly, she studied the Willowbrook Covenant with the same attention to detail she'd once used to design spacecraft components. See, most people just skim HOA covenants. They look for the obvious stuff. No boats in driveways, keep your grass green, don't paint your house neon purple. But Margaret read every single word of those 47 pages like her life depended on it. And what she found was beautiful. The covenant had dozens of vague, contradictory, and poorly written rules. Section 4.7, the one they'd used to fine her, said decorations should be modest and in keeping with community standards. But it didn't define modest. It didn't specify limits. It didn't even say what community standards meant. Section 3.2 said homeowners had the right to reasonable enjoyment of their property within covenant guidelines. Section 6.1 required the HOA to apply all rules fairly and consistently. And Section 8.4, this was Margaret's favorite, stated that any homeowner could request a detailed review of board decisions with full documentation of the reasoning behind enforcement actions. Richard had handed her the tools for his own destruction. By September, Margaret had her battle plan ready. She was going to put up a Christmas display that would be so spectacular, so over the top, so absolutely bonkers, that it would expose the HOA's selective enforcement and for the world to see. But here's the genius part. It was going to be 100% covenant compliant. Margaret had found every loophole, every vague clause, every poorly worded rule that she could exploit. The covenant said decorations should be modest, but it also said homeowners could express seasonal celebration within reasonable bounds. It prohibited excessive displays but required fair and consistent enforcement. If Richard wanted to play games with undefined terms and selective enforcement, Margaret was going to show him what those games looked like when played by someone with a NASA-level attention to detail. In October, Margaret submitted a formal request to the HOA board. She wanted pre-approval for her 2023 Christmas display. She included detailed plans, electrical diagrams, and precise measurements. She cited every relevant section of the covenant and demonstrated how her display would comply with each requirement. The package was 23 pages long. Richard's response was exactly what Margaret expected. Denied. Proposed display violates Section 4.7. No specific reasoning, no details about which elements violated which rules, just the same vague brush-off he'd been using on widows and single mothers for years. Margaret smiled when she read that letter. Richard had just walked into her trap. See, Section 8.4 required the board to provide detailed reasoning for any enforcement decision. By denying her request without explanation, Richard had violated the HOA's own covenant. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She filed an appeal, requesting the detailed review that Section 8.4 guaranteed her. She wanted board meeting minutes, documentation of how they determined her display was non-compliant, and evidence of consistent enforcement of Section 4.7. The board's response, another form letter denial. Now Richard had violated multiple sections of his own covenant. He'd failed to provide required documentation, ignored due process requirements, and demonstrated clear selective enforcement. Margaret had all the ammunition she needed. It was time to go nuclear. On November 1st, 2023, Margaret started decorating. And folks, when I tell you this woman had been planning, she'd spent $47,000 on Christmas decorations. $47,000. She'd hired a team of professional installers, rented industrial-grade electrical equipment, and even brought in a structural engineer to make sure her house could handle the load. But she was just getting started. Margaret's display went live on December 1st, 2023 at exactly 6 p.m., and holy hell. Picture the most elaborate Christmas display you've ever seen. Now multiply that by about 50. Margaret had 2.3 million LED lights covering every square inch of her property. The house itself looked like a glowing spaceship. She had 47 inflatable decorations, including a 30-foot Santa that required guy wires to keep it stable. There were animated reindeer, dancing elves, and a snow machine that created its own weather system. The light show was synchronized to music that played through speakers powerful enough to rattle windows 3 blocks away. Every 15 minutes, the entire display would go dark for exactly 10 seconds, then explode back to life with a crescendo that could be heard from the highway. But here's the beautiful part. Margaret had documented everything. Every single decoration, every light string, every inflatable Santa was cataloged and cross-referenced with specific covenant sections that allowed it. The 30-foot Santa, Section 3.4 allowed seasonal decorations of reasonable height. It didn't define reasonable, and Margaret had examples of other subdivisions with similar displays. The music, Section 5.2 permitted reasonable noise levels during daytime hours. The music played from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., well within most communities' quiet hours. The 2.3 million lights? The covenant mentioned modest decorations, but also emphasized seasonal celebration. Margaret had calculated the light per square foot ratio and compared it to professional holiday displays at shopping centers and theme parks. By that metric, her display was actually quite reasonable. Margaret had turned malicious compliance into an art form. Within 24 hours, Margaret's house became the destination in Seattle. Cars were lined up for miles just to drive past. Local news crews showed up. People were live streaming the light show on social media. Margaret's display had its own hashtag Willowbrook Christmas Nuclear. And the HOA board? They were losing their minds. Richard started calling Margaret at 7 a.m. the next morning. She didn't answer. He left 17 voicemails that day, each one more frantic than the last. "Mrs. Chen, this is completely unacceptable. You need to take this down immediately. This is a violation of community standards. We're going to fine you. You're creating a public disturbance. This is harassment." But Margaret had prepared for this too. She'd installed security cameras around her property and was recording every interaction. She'd also hired a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. And oh boy, did her lawyer love this case. On December 3rd, Margaret received a cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney. It demanded she remove the display within 24 hours or face leg. All action. Margaret's response was epic. Her lawyer sent back a 47-page brief, 1 page for every page of the original covenant. It systematically destroyed every argument the HOA had made. It cited specific covenant sections that permitted Margaret's display. It documented Richard's history of selective enforcement, and it included a fascinating legal argument about the HOA's obligation to define their own rules. But the best part was the ending. Margaret was countersuing the HOA for harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of her right to reasonable enjoyment of her property. She was asking for $500,000 in damages. The HOA backed down immediately. Well, sort of. They couldn't legally force Margaret to remove the display, but Richard had other ideas. On December 5th, the city received an anonymous complaint about Margaret's display. Someone had claimed it was a fire hazard that blocked emergency access and created dangerous traffic conditions. Gee, who could that have been? But Margaret had anticipated this too. She'd gotten pre-approval from the fire department, hired traffic management services, and even coordinated with local police to handle the crowds. When the fire inspector showed up, he actually complimented Margaret on her safety planning. Her electrical work was professional grade, she had proper emergency access, and her traffic management was better than most commercial businesses. The inspector's report officially cleared Margaret's display as completely safe. Richard was running out of options, but he wasn't ready to give up. If he couldn't stop Margaret legally, he'd try to turn the neighborhood against her. That was his biggest mistake yet. Richard's next move was to call an emergency HOA meeting. He wanted to pass new rules that would specifically target Margaret's display, and he was hoping to rally the other homeowners against her. The meeting was scheduled for December 10th, the community center. Richard sent out notices to all 247 homeowners in Willowbrook Estates, along with a passionate letter about preserving our community's character and stopping the circus that's taken over our neighborhood. Margaret showed up with her lawyer, a folder full of documentation, and a recorder to capture everything for her lawsuit. What happened next was absolutely beautiful. See, Richard had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed the other homeowners would be angry about the traffic, the noise, and the disruption to their quiet suburban paradise. Instead, most of them were furious at the HOA board. It turns out Margaret wasn't the only person who'd been harassed by Richard's selective enforcement. The elderly couple with the bird feeder stood up to describe how they'd been fined repeatedly for minor violations while their neighbors got away with much worse. The single mom talked about getting cited for parking violations that other residents violated daily. The widow with the garden gnomes had documentation going back 3 years showing a pattern of targeting. But the real bombshell came from Tom Morrison, a 45-year-old accountant who lived 2 streets over. Tom had been keeping his own records of HOA enforcement, and he'd discovered something incredible. Over the past 5 years, Richard had issued 127 violation notices. Of those, 89 had gone to single women, elderly residents, or minority homeowners. Families with traditional nuclear households, especially ones with higher property values, rarely got cited for anything. Richard had been running a protection racket disguised as an HOA board. The meeting that was supposed to rally support against Margaret turned into a 3-hour testimony session about Richard's abuse of power. Homeowners who'd never spoken up before were suddenly sharing stories of harassment, arbitrary enforcement, and intimidation tactics. Margaret didn't even need to defend her Christmas display. The community was too busy calling for Richard's resignation. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. In a move that was as desperate as it was stupid, he tried to have Margaret's electricity shut off. He called the power company claiming there was an illegal electrical modification at Margaret's address. He filed complaints with the city about unpermitted electrical work. He even tried to get the fire department to red tag her house for electrical hazards. Every single complaint was investigated and dismissed. Margaret's electrical work was not only legal, it was better than code requirement. She'd hired master electricians, gotten proper permits, and had everything inspected multiple times. Meanwhile, the media was having a field day with the story. Local news outlets were calling it the HOA Christmas Wars. Social media was exploding with hashtag Team Margaret posts. A local radio station started doing daily updates called Willowbrook Watch. But the story really took off when someone leaked audio of Richard's voicemails to Margaret. 17 increasingly unhinged messages of a middle-aged man having a complete meltdown over Christmas lights. The recordings went viral. Within 48 hours, Richard Pemberton became the most hated HOA president in America. The local news was playing clips of him screaming about community standards, while Margaret's spectacular light display twinkled in the background. Richard tried to fight back by claiming Margaret was destroying property values and turning the neighborhood into a theme park. He organized a petition to remove her from the subdivision and threatened legal action against anyone supporting her. This backfired spectacularly. Property values in Willowbrook Estates actually went up during December 2023. Real estate agents were using Margaret's house as a selling point. Lived just 3 blocks from the famous Christmas house. Suddenly, everyone wanted to move to the neighborhood with the amazing holiday displays. Local businesses were thriving too. Hotels were booking up with Christmas tourists. Restaurants along the route to Margaret's house were packed every night. The city was making a fortune on parking fees and tourist taxes. Margaret's nuclear Christmas display had accidentally turned Willowbrook Estates into Seattle's premier holiday destination. Richard was watching his crusade against Margaret boost everyone's property values and bring prosperity to the entire area. The thing he claimed would destroy the neighborhood was actually making it the most desirable place to live in the county. By December 15th, Richard was completely isolated. The other board members had distanced themselves from his tactics. Half the neighborhood had signed a petition demanding his removal. His own neighbors weren't speaking to him. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She had one final move that would turn Richard's world completely upside down. On December 20th, Margaret made an announcement that nobody saw coming. She was buying Richard's house. See, while Richard had been focused on his Christmas light crusade, he'd missed some important financial details. His mortgage was an adjustable rate that had ballooned during 2023's interest rate increases. He'd also been borrowing against his home equity to pay for legal fees in his fight against Margaret. Richard was facing foreclosure, and Margaret had been quietly coordinating with his lender to purchase the property. The woman he'd tried to bully out of the neighborhood was about to become his next-door neighbor's landlord. But Margaret's offer came with conditions. Richard could stay in his house as a tenant, but he had to resign from the HOA board immediately and publicly apologize for his harassment campaign. The alternative was foreclosure, bankruptcy, and having his family evicted right before Christmas. As Richard signed the papers on December 22nd, Margaret's Christmas display stayed up until January 15, 2024, exactly 1 month longer than traditional holiday displays. It was her final act of malicious compliance, exploiting another poorly written covenant rule about reasonable duration of seasonal decorations. But the real satisfaction came from the HOA election in March 2024. Margaret ran for HOA president, and it wasn't even close. She won with 89% of the vote on a platform of transparent governance and fair enforcement. One of her first acts as president was to completely rewrite the covenant. The new rules were clear, specific, and fair. No more vague language about community standards. No more arbitrary enforcement. Every rule had clear definitions, objective criteria, and consistent penalties. Margaret also implemented a review board for all violation notices, required documentation for enforcement decisions, and established an appeals process that couldn't be dismissed with form letters. As for Richard, he lasted exactly 4 months as Margaret's tenant before moving out of Willowbrook Estates entirely. Word is he bought a condo in a building with no HOA rules whatsoever. Margaret scaled back her Christmas display for 2024, but it was still spectacular. The difference was that now it was part of an official neighborhood tradition. The new HOA covenant actually encourages festive holiday celebrations that bring joy to our community. Willowbrook Estates now has an annual Christmas light contest with prizes for creativity, community spirit, and best use of technology. Margaret serves as the head judge, and yes, she's won twice. The subdivision has become known as one of the most homeowner-friendly communities in the Seattle area. Property values are up 23% since 2023, and there's a waiting list of people who want to buy homes there. Margaret still lives in the same house, still decorates every Christmas, and still serves as HOA president. But now she uses her engineering skills to help other homeowners navigate bureaucracy instead of fighting it. And Richard? Last I heard, he was working as a night shift security guard at a mall. Apparently, he's very good at following other people's rules. So there you have it. The story of how Margaret Chen turned Christmas decorations into the ultimate HOA revenge plot. What started as a $150 fine for excessive holiday decorations ended with a complete transformation of an entire community. But here's what I love most about Margaret's story. She didn't just fight back against a bully. She used the system's own rules to expose how broken it was, then fixed it for everyone else. Too many HOA horror stories end with homeowners giving up, moving away, or just accepting abuse from power-hungry board members. Margaret proved that sometimes the best defense is a really, really spectacular offense. Plus, let's be honest, 2.3 million Christmas lights synchronized to music, that's not revenge, that's art. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that made Richard Pemberton look reasonable? What's the most ridiculous violation notice you've ever received? And be honest, if you had Margaret's resources and engineering skills, how far would you have taken it? Drop your HOA horror stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed watching Richard get his comeuppance, smash that like button and subscribe for more suburban justice stories. Next week, we're diving into the tale of an HOA that tried to ban a veteran's flagpole and learned why you should never mess with someone who knows military regulations better than you know your own bylaws. Until then, remember, read your HOA covenant carefully. You never know when you might need to use it as a weapon.